people just start putting questions into the comments, and we'll see. Let's say, all right, not seeing any questions yet. Let's see, what else should I say to get things going? Yeah, I'll say this. I've written a lot of things, but the only thing I've ever written that actually clearly improved the world is my Natalism book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. This is a book where I've got what I think is good evidence that there's hundreds of people that had extra kids because I wrote the book. I actually changed people's minds, and people were in a position to go and do something about it. That was, well, if you use economists' usual $10 million per life, then I'll claim to have created billions of dollars with that book, which is a lot more than I've ever done with any other one. In fact, it's not clear that any of my other books have actually changed the world at all, but that book has. Not enough to actually move birth rates, but nevertheless, more than enough to actually justify my whole existence on Earth, I think, many times over. All right, so we got a first question. Let's see. All right, great. All right, so first question here. Love Selfish Reasons for More Kids. What do you think of the Ansoni proposal to forward fund kids plus retirement with giving parents a percentage of kids' taxes? Yeah, it's a reasonable idea. Obviously, there's some libertarian objections to it. I think that the easiest one, and one that no libertarian could object to, would just be to say we're going to start reducing Social Security payments with people who don't have enough kids. So you could keep the current payment for the most fertile people and then reduce for everybody else, and you could go down to nothing for people with no kids. That would be a one that I don't think libertarians could object to. The general consequentialist point or utilitarian point of any way that you could somehow arrange for a bribe from oblivion into reality to get people to have more kids would be an efficiency gain. That's true. I understand that perspective, but it's a bit too strong for me. Let's see. We got Usri. What is your opinion about Hansen proposal about cultural drift as an explanation for low TFR? I mean, my main argument with Robin about this cultural drift stuff is that I don't think that many things in the modern world are dysfunctional. I think that low fertility is the one really obvious thing, and otherwise, I say we are just so much better than almost any previous historical society. I think that the First World, for all its flaws, is still much better than almost any other society throughout human history. So I think that he is just overreaching in terms of thinking that he's seen some horrible problem, whereas I say I see one problem. And even that problem, as I've said, I don't think of low fertility as something that's an existential risk or going to cause society collapse. It's just disappointing. Just something that things could have been a lot better. There could have been a lot more people enjoying this world. Things could have moved faster. That's unfortunate, but it doesn't mean that we are actually going to regress. Now, let's see. So as an explanation specifically for low total fertility rate, I'd say, well, like in principle, like you could have had cultural drift towards high fertility. There's the story of when people are comfortable and things are okay. That's where there isn't a lot of selection pressure to go and do something different. But I would say that it's probably correct, but it's just too vague, and I'd rather get an explanation that focused on exactly what kind of cultural drift are we talking about. I think the main kind of cultural drift that we have is going to be things like, let's see, what's the right way of putting it? One kind of cultural drift is helicopter parenting, just thinking that you're a terrible parent unless you are really going and working very hard to go and give your kids the best possible future. Let's see. And then, so other ones that we can think about. Again, you might say that being really focused on what I call the medium term effects of high fertility. So, as I said before, if people have no impulse control, we won't have any fertility problems. If people just immediately have unprotected sex anytime they feel like it, the world will be packed with life. I don't recommend that. But if we just had no impulse control at all, then we would have no fertility problem. On the other hand, but I've also said if we had very good impulse control and very good foresight, we would be thinking about, well, what will our lives be like when we're older? And you would then want to make sure that you've got enough kids to keep your life full of social contact and connection. So you might say the cultural drift is this thing that we actually have, which is what I call intermediate foresight, where you are worried enough about the next few years to say, I better not have any kids that could mess up my life, but you aren't that worried about your life in 30 years when, in a way, you've messed up your life by not having kids when you were younger. All right, let's see. Here we are. Is there a way to expand concern about population trends beyond natalism, which sounds normative? You should have kids. Let's see. Hmm. Well, I mean, of course, I think the normal version of natalism is not actually admonishing people to have kids, but just trying to have policies to encourage it. So France is the classic example of a natalist country. It's a country where they have famously a lot of policies giving financial and related incentives to have kids. Um, I've been in France many times. I didn't see any sign that there was propaganda around saying, you should be having more kids. What is wrong with you? You must do this for the glory of France. It's basically it's fairly invisible, actually. You have to really be there and know what kind of incentives you are. The only thing I learned firsthand is when I was talking to philosopher Johan Elster, and he said how since he was over like 60, I think he actually got his retirement age extended for having an extra kids. So see, he's like in the regular French public university system with mandatory retirement, and then more kids you have, the later you get to retire. That doesn't work for U.S. academia, of course, because we have infinite our retirement age is already effectively infinite. So anyway, like if you don't want to go and talk to people about having more kids, you could just go and give them incentives. Again, most of what I did in Selfish Reason to Have More Kids was not so much saying you ought to have more kids, but rather to say, step one, go and rethink your parenting strategy. And then step two, once you have done that, reconsider whether you are still at the optimal family size. So that's kind of different from being totally normative. All right, let's see. Is freezing eggs an important practice to implement to allow people to change their mind later on? It's not important quantitatively. Not many people are in the situation where they actually are saying, well, I don't know if I want kids. Maybe I want more. I need this as an insurance policy. It's a very tiny share of fertility policy. IVF is a very small share of births. And people that are doing it with frozen eggs that they froze when they were young to get ready for having kids when they're old, that's a small share of a small share. Again, we can imagine that changing over time, but probably the main reason why people aren't having kids is that when they're old is that they feel like they're too tired, and if they really wanted them, they would have done it when they're young, and they feel like they don't have the energy to do it. I think that it's a good idea, and even if you think that you don't want kids right now, if you, especially your woman, you're worried about your fertility falling off, just say, look, 10% chance I will want to have kids. It's a good idea to freeze my eggs so I don't have fertility problems. That's just the kind of thinking that I would recommend for people. But it's not actually important now. Let's see, whatever happened to the book on poverty working on a few years ago? Great question. And I'm super gratified that people keep asking me this because it means there is demand. I was working on it during COVID, and then I got my idea for the book I'm working on now, Unbeatable, The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets. And I decided that this was a better book than Poverty. I think Poverty is going to be a really great book, but Unbeatable, I think, might be the best thing that I'll ever do. I wanted to get it done. And I also felt like I could get it done faster. So I'm wrapping that book up right now. I'm basically just about ready to write the conclusion of the book. So that I think I will be able to submit a nearly final version to publishers by the end of the summer or so. And then hopefully it'll be out in a year. Once that book's out the door, then I'll probably start working on the poverty book again. Anyway, I'm really glad people like the book enough to keep pestering me about it. That's not often that happens. All right. Uh, did economists evaluate correlation between pronatal expenses and birth rate? And how much in dollar is the positive externality of a kid? Yeah, good questions. Okay. Correlation between pronatal expenses and birth rate. Let's see. So there is a piece that I wrote for Cato Unbound about 15 years ago where I tried to snap together two different literatures. So one literature is experiments on how much of a baby bonus do you need to get someone to have an extra kid. Particularly, I relied upon this one study from Quebec where it was a really good experiment where they did all the things you want in an experiment. So only Quebec's affected versus the rest of Canada. Not everybody in Quebec is equally affected. The policy turns on at different times, affects different people in different ways. So there's all those kinds of delicate variation that you're hoping for in an experiment. And that one came up with a fairly modest estimate of how much you have to give people in a baby bonus to get them to have another kid. And then I snapped that together with some other papers that estimate the net tax value of another baby. So another baby is born. What is the net amount of taxes, so present value of taxes they'll ever pay minus present value of services they'll ever use? And that paper said that typical baby born in the U.S. has a very large, very high present value. The usual view is the only countries where babies have a negative fiscal value are your oil-rich countries, where they're basically sharing the oil revenues with the citizens, like Saudi Arabia. But for almost any other country, then typical baby is net positive. So you snap that together, and what was easy to show is that if these numbers are right, then, very excitingly, a policy where you just give baby bonuses one way or the other, or especially, as I suggested, if you give a tax cut to people the year they have a baby, or maybe just a whole tax holiday for the year they have a baby, this is actually a tax cut that is the holy grail of tax policy, namely a tax cut that more than pays for itself in the long run. So Arthur Laffer famously claimed this was true for income tax cuts. Almost no one believes that. But natalist baby bonuses of different kinds seem like they really are ones where if you're thinking about the full budget constraint of the government over the course of the life of that person that's born, it's actually net positive. Now notice, that's only what we could call the fiscal externality. That is not getting anywhere close to the total externalities of other births. I don't know that anyone has tried to add all that stuff up. It's big, right? The biggest one does require some controversial philosophy because, at least if you accept this idea, then this is worth many millions of dollars per birth. So this is sometimes called the existence externality, and it's basically how much would you pay to exist if you didn't exist? All right, some people don't like that philosophically and say it's a meaningless question. I think it is a meaningful question when a supervillain says, I will make you wish you had never been born. They are not threatening to make you a little bit worse off. They're threatening to make you a lot worse off because the idea is that there's actually huge surplus for being alive. Anyway, so if you believe in that existence externality, then every birth is actually worth millions of dollars. And how is it an externality? Because you can't pay people to do something until you exist. Right? And again, if people don't like that philosophically, you say, like, how is it different from an externality while you're sleeping? Or an externality from a coma where you'll definitely wake up in 5 years? I think that you can think of non-existence as being functionally the same as just being in a coma or being asleep. So you put that in, then that's really big. And then in terms of other ones, there's this innovation externality, which is big. I don't know that anyone has really measured it. One that actually wouldn't be so hard to measure is just what I call the, what's the right one? What's the right? I call it the choice externality. This is one where you just look at difference in property value between high density areas and low density areas and say that the real reason why high density areas are more valuable is because you're around more people, which gives you more career opportunities, social opportunities, shopping opportunities, cultural opportunities. Of course, there's also a bunch of bad things about being around people, parking, traffic, noise. Interesting thing is that you can get rid of all the problems of population by moving to the middle of nowhere, but hardly anybody does that, despite the fact you save a lot of money. So you can go and think about those disparities in price between high and low population areas as at least a pretty reasonable measure of externalities of population, though it does not bring in the externalities of the larger area, which are harder to do. All right, then we got what? Do you think there's a correlation between being pronatalist and being born in a big family? I'm almost sure there is. There is a correlation between being born in a big family and having more kids. I don't think that it's very big, though, just because, definitely conscious pronatalism is so rare that it can't correlate very much with much of anything in the general population because most people just aren't. If you just think of it as, if you define pronatalism as more broadly as just being, as liking kids or thinking it's not so bad to have a big family, then I think it is pretty, at least moderate. In Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, I go over the twin studies on fertility, and punchline is that, as usual, there is a substantial genetic effect on fertility, not just completed fertility, which could be biological, but also desired fertility, which is psychological. General rule in behavioral genetics is almost every psychological trait has a substantial genetic component, so not surprising this one would too. Jason Ford. Dennis Prager said that on his show that based on his observations, most women get their happiness from their children and family. Does the data support his observation? Yeah, that's a good question. All right. So around the time I was writing Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, there were a whole lot of newspaper articles saying that kids make you totally miserable, kids are terrible. If you go and look at the research they're based on, what they really show is that on average, people that have kids are all else equal slightly less happier than people without kids. All right. So on the one hand, that definitely shows that the slogan of kids make you miserable is wrong. On the other hand, it doesn't confirm Dennis Prager. If you dig more closely, what you see is that the very happiest people are married but childless. And then second group of happiest people are people who are married with kids, and that's a small gap. And then the third group, which is way down there, is single and childless. And then the people who are least happy are the single parents. All right, so that's the actual pecking order: is married without kids, married with kids, single without kids, and then single with kids. Important point that people pointed out, though, is that especially durability of marriage is not unrelated to having kids. Childless marriages are much less likely to last. On the other hand, marriages with the kids are a lot more stable. The cynical version of this is, yeah, people stay married unhappily when they have kids. No doubt there's some of that, but the deeper lesson is that actually a lot of marital instability is impulsive. A lot of it is not actually that the couple is deeply incompatible. Rather, they are just mad about each other over some fairly trivial things. And if they don't have kids, then they don't bother working it out. And if they do have kids, they put in the extra effort and they work it out. I don't remember the sources, but I remember reading multiple papers on the theme of if people say they're unhappy with their marriage and they just stick it out, then usually things actually improve. Right? Not in every case, of course. But anyway, what's the upshot of this? The upshot of this is that Dennis Prager actually really is onto something important. And it's not just for women, it's actually for men as well, which is that marriage seems to be a crucial element of being happy for most people. There's a huge gap in happiness between the married and the single. And kids are basically a self-control mechanism that keeps people from destroying marriages impulsively. And so it is a good way of cementing marital stability, which overall turns out to be good for people. It's not just a set of handcuffs where you're like stuck in something where you're unhappy, although obviously that occasionally happens. But it's more like the golden handcuffs where it's like, well, this keeps me doing something that I might be tempted to impulsively ruin, but I'm going to look at my kids and say, for them, I will put in the extra effort to work it out. And normally when people commit to working out, it does work out, actually. What's your estimation is the relation between public subsidy for higher education and fertility? Is there any good work trying to quantify this? Public subsidy for higher education and fertility. Okay, so as I talk about in the case against education, there are a bunch of papers that estimate the effect of tuition and other kind of financial cost on college attendance. And all of these find that there's a substantial effect of spending on college attendance. Basically, the more government subsidizes school, the more people go. I think that, again, like the data, it's a bit out of date, so the numbers would need to be readjusted for inflation and stuff like that. I think it's, basically a few $1,000s will raise college attendance up by at least 1 percentage point, and then college graduation by less than that. It's much easier to raise attendance than graduation, but both are sensitive to spending. All right, so that's step one in this chain of reasoning: is how sensitive is education to the government spending? And the answer is definitely moderate sensitivity. By making it cheaper, you do encourage more people to do it. Without the government subsidy, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. Without the government subsidy, my view is that the share of people attending college in the U.S. would fall by at least 50%. That's for the 4-year, and I think basically community college would almost disappear because that's so subsidized. And also, people in community college are just so marginally there. They're so, their dropout rates are so high already. All right, now the next step would be what's the relationship between educational attainment and fertility, and that's one that I was just looking at recently. That's one where the sensitivity is quite high, and let's see, a good way of thinking about it is that on average, completed fertility differs between women with college degrees and women who I think are high school dropouts. Completed fertility differs by about a whole child, with the college graduate women having on average about one full fewer children. So if you put that together, let's see. So if the total education of, or total share of college graduates would fall in half, that would basically be, let's see, reducing it from like 35 to like 17.5. So let's say that's like a sixth. And then, figure that gets rid of like 4 years. So basically that's going to reduce the average college attainment or average educational attainment of the population by what, like 2/3 of a year. That's probably an understatement, because if you don't go to undergraduate, you don't do grad school too. So let's cut it. Let's bring it up to cutting the subsidies will reduce the amount of education of the whole population by a year. And yeah, so that would probably raise fertility by like 0.25. All right, so that's my math on the fly. I could do better if I had the numbers in front of me, but I feel like you can snap that all together and get a pretty good answer. All right, let's see. Clifford. How do you estimate the amount of time that it might take for genetic evolution to fix birth rates? Let's see. I'm going to have trouble doing that math in my head, but let's see. So I think like a standard heritability estimate is something like 0.3. All right, and that's telling you that the correlation between identical twins raised apart in their completed fertility would be like 0.3. So then what do we have to do? And that's hard. You got to get a whole distribution. So, and then that's, compounding every generation. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to do this in my head, but I think that just over the course of 100, 200 years, that's where I think the math is going to come out as that'll get us back from, so I think that would be enough to get us from like 1 to 2. All right, so I think that's pretty reasonable. And then principle that actually should grow exponentially. So once you've got it growing and those genes start spreading, and then also your basic lesson of experimental genetics or experimental evolution is that once you have a big breeding pool, then you start getting enough mutations, and you get more mutations, and then they spread, and then what you might think of as an upper bound actually turns out to be not an upper bound at all. There's a book that I reviewed 20 years ago for Marginal Revolution called Selection: The Mechanism of Evolution. It's probably the coolest book on evolution that I've ever read, because they have actual experiments, mostly on animals with very quick life cycles, like fruit flies. And they do experiments on things like how big can we make fruit flies if we just select the biggest fruit flies for a bunch of generations. And one of the results is that within 30 breeding cycles, you can get fruit flies where the smallest fruit fly in the cohort is bigger than the biggest one in the original one. So evolution really does actually have incredible flexibility. And on top of that, they also find that sometimes you appear to reach a plateau in selection, and then you break the plateau. So you might have 4 generations where you're breeding the big ones, they're not getting any bigger, and you might say, well, this is as big as they can go. And then suddenly it bursts forward, and then you realize, oh, what's going on is that there must have been a mutation, and the mutation for the larger size now is quickly spreading through the population. All right, so John Alcorn. The arms race for educational credentials delays marriage and thereby reduces fertility. Is there feasible policy to reduce or delay educational attainment? Yes, John, it's implied in what I said. Just slash the subsidies. It is not true that people go to college automatically. There are some people that will. There's some families that either are rich enough or they're just so committed. But there's a lot of marginal people out there, and a lot of people for whom the cost is actually a major issue. Even many people who are quite high in income live hand to mouth. I'm always shocked when I hear about corporate lawyers who just run out and spend their money as soon as they get it, but they really do exist. And that means that if the cost of education were to go up, there's a lot of people that would not be prepared for that. A lot of families wouldn't be prepared for that, which may be sad for the individual children, but is wonderful for society because of this horrible credential inflation that we've got. So it really just comes down to, can you actually get government to cut spending? Right? And right now, I claim zero credit for any cuts that Trump is making to higher ed, but you can see how terrified they are of losing their money. In a way, it's even greater than I think, because if I were Columbia, I would just say, we got billions of dollars in endowment, we can ride this out for 4 years, but they're too chicken even to do that. Usual stories, oh, but those assets aren't liquid. Gee, is there a way to convert liquid assets or illiquid assets into liquid assets? I think there's probably some way of doing it, which, if you cared, you would do it. All right, Patrick. Hypothetically, would you be interested in cloning yourself? Yeah, this is one of the most controversial things I ever wrote accidentally. I'm totally interested in cloning myself. I would love to raise several young me's as my sons. I would pay an enormous amount of money to do it. I think I would do a great job. I think I would be so simpatico with cloned me, and I could give them such a fantastic life. Anyway, so I wrote this for March Revolution. This one was strangely controversial. A bunch of people got very angry, and like, some guy I never heard of wants to do something that's not possible. I hate him. It was controversial enough that someone actually emailed my wife to let her know what I was writing. And then I came home and she said, so, anything interesting happening in the world of blogging today? I'm like, well, I don't know. What do you hear? So anyway, there's some question about what would her role be in raising these clones? And of course, the obvious answer is never talked about it because it's not technologically even close to feasible. But yes, in terms of whether I would regard that as something I'd want to do, I am first in line to want to do that. All right. Let's see. More French. Let's see. Okay. I've written actually a role-playing game where you play members of the French League. Here you play the French superheroes of the 1980s. It is a French super team, and in order to play well, you must stay in character the entire time. All right, so that is something, if you want to play that at Caplan, it's called The French League versus Tyrannism. It's a period piece set in 1983. And let's see, the French superheroes you get to play are the Legionnaire, who's the head of the team. He's like a French super soldier. He's France's answer to Captain America. There is Jeanne d'Arc, so she is a living embodiment of Joan of Arc. There is Roland, who is a time-traveling French knight from whatever, the 8th century, and now he's in the modern world. There is Fraternité, who is the mentalist, who can control the minds of the people. And then there is, let's see, Babouf, who is the French communist gadgeteer, who looks like the original fat French communist, anarcho-communist Babouf. And then finally, there is Frenchman, who is a cut-rate Superman who can fly but not very fast. All right, so anyway, if that sounds absolutely insane to you, this is a story that I wrote, and it does involve a libertarian supervillain, and the French team has to beat him. Okay. Enjoyed your speech at NatalCon. Thank you very much, Yuri. All right, let's see. Would you expect affordable and common polygenic editing for traits in children to increase or decrease fertility? Great question. I just did a Twitter poll on this, and while you can say there's self-selection to my readers, I've done other polls where I've just asked people about how self-selected they are, and the answer is people that respond to my polls at least claim to only be moderately self-selected. In particular, when I gave them the option of what fraction of Bryan's controversial views do you agree with, the most popular answer was 26 to 50%. So it's nothing like people only respond to my polls if they are totally in communion with me. So anyway, I just did this poll asking people where if you could go and actually determine the desired number of children that your offspring through IVF would have, how many would you want them to desire? And 4+ got the mode, almost the median. So it was over 40% of people said that they would want their kids to want 4+. The second most popular answer was people wouldn't do it. 20% of people said they wouldn't do it even if they're already doing IVF. That was crucial because you have to imagine you're already doing IVF and then someone says, hey, do you want to edit the fertility preference? So some people, even ones that were willing to answer a survey about IVF, said you shouldn't touch that, that's wrong. But in general, virtually no one said they wanted, I think it was like 2% said they would make them want 0 or 1 kids. And the most popular answer was definitely a lot of kids. So I think that is a totally reasonable conclusion, is that people actually would want to edit kids that would want a lot of kids themselves. Okay. There's a free market for surrogate mothers. Would it boost natality? So I think it's very likely that it would. Obviously, there's the complication of it might be that surrogate mothers cut down on their own fertility in order to go and do the job. My guess is that it's positive overall. Obviously, it is positive for the rich countries. As to whether it's positive for the poor countries, I mean, I'm not sure, but I think a lot of what's going on is this would be such a fantastic source of income for poor women in India and countries like that. And I guess I haven't mentioned this, but um, at least in the countries that I've looked at, while it is true that on average rich people have fewer kids than poor people, if you do the horse race, the multiple regression, turns out that by itself more income increases fertility, and rather it's education which is crushing to fertility. So pretty much the result is that the highest fertility people are high income, low education. High income, low education, it's like plumbers. And the lowest fertility people are like PhDs driving Uber, high education, low income. All right, so yeah, I think it probably would, but I'm not sure. If you read the Wall Street Journal story about the governor incentives for dating in Korea, it seems to be failing. Surprise, but doesn't this show the limit of top-down solutions? So I did not read the story. I would say in general that, first of all, the standard of whether any particular natalist policy is working, often people have the ridiculous standard of, did it raise fertility up to replacement? If no, then it's a failure. Right, so that's silly. You should be thinking in terms of marginal changes, not hitting a certain target. And then the second one people do is, well, it was falling before, kept falling, therefore didn't work. It's like, well, it might have fallen faster. All right, so my understanding is actually Korean fertility actually finally turned up recently, most likely just randomly, but in any case, it wouldn't be shocking if something had worked. But finally, I would also just say governor incentives for dating, I don't know what that is, but the main thing that I'll say about almost all of the natalist incentives I've seen is that they're all really small. People talk about Hungary spending 5% of GDP on this stuff. Layman Stone says those numbers are really misleading and it's hard to know what's going on. But even if that's right, 5% of GDP is not actually that much if you think that you are going to get double the population in a generation as a result. You might say, let's go and spend 20% or 30%. So I'd say the main thing is think about ways of getting it up. My personal idea that like I said, I really like, I just think like tax holiday every year you have a kid, right? It's very simple and it's front loaded. I think it's likely that front loading it and just making it that transparent, but also you get this that very year, I think that's going to be something that really influences people, and it's just hard not to notice it. Could be wrong, but I like to see experiments doing it. Obviously, we say, why just 1 year? Why not 2? Yeah, great. Let's do 2. All right, to see how much it takes. I mean, really, like if the question is, will anything work? That's a good reason for some country just to go hog wild and just try going really far and see what they can get done. All right. So I'm not sure if you cover this. Do you think do you think there's an ideal age for people to start having children? Also, what do you think about IVF as a benefit for an employer? So ideal age, I'll say no, not an ideal age. Like it totally does depend upon the individual. I'm not a strong enough natalist to even say every single person should have kids. There's some people who just do not like it. I believe they're real. They're not going to change their mind. And if this is a person who's a stranger, I'm just all right, whatever. I'm not going to worry about that person. If it's my kid, then I'm a lot more involved, and then I'm more likely to start saying, yeah, okay, well, come on, let's figure out a way to make this happen anyway, even if you don't want to do it. I can make it worth your while, right? But in terms of ideal age, so like some of the things that obviously matter, like do you have parental support? Not just in terms of childcare and things like that. Do you have parental support in terms of money? Like I'm someone that I consider giving money to my kids for having kids to be one of the very best ways I could possibly spend money. I am a compulsive saver. I've got very high net worth. and I can think of almost nothing better to do with the money than to go and hand out my own baby bonuses to my own kids. And yeah, I am hoping that will speed things along, definitely. Uh, so in terms of what would I recommend? I mean, the general rule of finishing school before you do it, I did that myself. I understand why people want to do that. It is hard, especially if you don't have either material or financial support from parents. So probably I would advise people to think about marriage earlier. So getting married while you're still in school is, I think, a reasonable idea, especially for doing anything beyond undergraduate. Again, I would not have any hard and fast rule here, but generally try to actually talk to the person and find out what's going on in their lives and how they're feeling and what their experiences are. A lot of what I tell people is, first of all, before you start thinking about how many kids you want to have, how about you meet some children, babysit, volunteer to babysit. You can learn a lot by doing that. All right. IVF is a benefit from an employer. Um, I can understand why it has value. As an employer, I would be thinking about adverse selection. Like, do I really want to be encouraging high fertility among my employees? It's inconvenient for me. That's just a harsh reality there. Uh, again, you may say that we are going to try to have a reputation so that people really want to be here for the long term. All right, that could be a strategy. But yes, I totally understand why employers are nervous about hiring and especially giving expensive training to women who seem like they're about to have kids, it's a bad deal for them. In a world without discrimination law, you could go and handle this by having different either you could do it with different wages based upon your propensity to be having kids, or you could actually write contracts where you say like what your plans are, and if you violate it, then you lose something. So this is another option, which again I know a lot of other natalists will freak out about, and I'll say, well, you got to take a labor economics class to see how complicated this stuff actually is. Let's see. France had a huge pronatalist lobby in the 19th century to exempt parents and husbands from conscription. Ended up expectedly with plenty of people haphazardly getting married. I don't know anything about that. I mean, at that time, I doubt that it at least led to a lot of broken homes. You might say that it led to lower marital happiness, but even that, I'm not sure. You might have seen the podcast that I did where I was talking to, let's see, what's the name of the podcast? Yeah, Moral Mayhem couple about arranged marriage. So if arranged marriage actually works well, possibly better in cultures where it's normal than typical marriages, then maybe earlier marriages are not such a problem either. Uh, Something that I know in your favor is that at the end of World War II, the U.S. actually had a giant wave of divorces from all of the war brides. So I think there was like a sudden giant spike in divorces, like divorce temporarily doubled or tripled, as a lot of women who had married a guy who then went off to war, the guy comes back and they can't stand each other. So maybe. Okay. Do you think there could be a realistic technological solution that could increase fertility? Yeah, totally, of course. So artificial wombs, if we could do that, I think that would make a huge difference. All right, pregnancy is hard. I mean, even there, it's heterogeneous. I have met a few women who actually told me that they love pregnancy so much they were sad to actually deliver the baby. If I were a woman, I would not feel that way. I like to sleep and be comfortable. And when they said, I'm like, all right, it takes all kinds. There's actually a lot of different opinions on this. But anyway, there's definitely a lot of women for whom pregnancy is really hard. And if we could have artificial wombs, that is a lot easier to deal with than arranging a surrogate where you've got a lot of stress. Like, will this person try to back out, or they're in another country? What if they just disappear? So especially we could have affordable artificial wombs. If you can even imagine having the artificial womb right in the home where you can sort of see your baby gestating, I'm not sure whether people would want that. I think it'd be cool. It'd be like a goldfish bowl with your baby growing inside of it. It's like, oh my God. All right. So I think that one is pretty high. And so anyway, that one I think is, if we could make it happen, I think that would be, if not transformative, I think that total fertility would rise by like 0.3 or zero point 0.4 anyway. Of course, there's a Man for Your Poverty book. We'll also need to write up a critique of the FDA. So the FDA, I'll say, I think that there's a bunch of other people who have already done as good of a job as I would. And so there's actually a website, I think it's just called FDA Watch, where Alex Tabarrok and Dan Klein collaborated to create a website that was basically of a book's level of thoroughness on the problems with the FDA. So that is good. The poverty book, I'm glad again to hear their support. And so this summer I am actually doing something that will feed into the poverty book eventually. So you may have read my stuff on the success sequence, this idea that in the United States, you can avoid being below the poverty line with near certainty if you do the following three things. One, finish high school. Two, work full time. Three, get married before you have kids. Crucially, these are all things you don't have to be Einstein to do. In fact, almost any person can do them without much difficulty. And then the question is, all right, so what's going on with poverty in East Asia, where it seems like compliance with this success sequence is very high? So anyway, I've got a Chinese language student, Eric Ma, who is helping me to go and look for data in mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau to see whether we can replicate this stuff for the success sequence for China and for the Chinese-speaking world in particular, to see whether we can actually, whether, as I suspect, they basically just don't have really severe poverty, at least in the three rich Chinese countries. All right, so if you go to Japan, I know Noah Smith did this thing saying, oh, there's a lot of poverty in Japan. And I'll just say, look, any measure that says there's a lot of poverty in Japan is just a bad measure. And there's some sense in which they basically don't have poverty. Right? Virtually, at least it is almost non-existent. If you just see how little homelessness there is and how functional the Japanese homeless are compared to the American ones, where you see the Japanese homeless, they don't appear to be begging, and they have these push carts that look perfectly organized, like a little convenience store. They're not bothering people, and there's hardly any of them around. The worst thing I saw in Osaka, I did find, or really stumble upon, a small encampment. Even the encampment, it looked really quite good by American standards. It looked more like sort of like you just wandered into a cheap campsite in West Virginia. It looked more like that, except of course that it was all single men that were in the camp. But anyway, so Japan, which clearly follows this sex sequence very strictly, looks to me like they really have almost no actual absolute poverty, whereas in the United States, as well as every country in Europe I've ever been, they definitely do have absolute poverty. And simplest story is behavior is much worse. Okay. Polygamists have a lot of kids. Can you share your thoughts on polygamy? Sure. The real story is that the successful polygamists have a lot of kids. So successful polygamous males, high status males have a lot of kids. But I guess it's probably true that polygamous women have an unusual number of kids per person, but probably not that. They probably aren't that fertile for highly religious women. I think that Mormon polygamous women are having fewer kids than Orthodox Jews, for example, even though the Orthodox Jews are not polygamous and the Mormon FDLDS are. General views on polygamy. I think it is an alternative lifestyle that has been, it continues to be strangely persecuted in the United States. Everything else is accepted. Why not polygamy? I was a big fan of the show Big Love, which should still be streaming on Max. First couple of seasons are great, and then it goes downhill, unfortunately. But I think like the last episode of season 4 is still fantastic, and then season 5, I was fast forwarding through most of it. The ending was pretty good, but anyway, the first 2 seasons were just divine, and I just love them with all my heart. And the backstory, Big Love, is that there, I think it was a gay male couple that found out about Mormon polygamy and decided to do it as an allegory for gay marriage. And it is actually worked in the show, like the head of the cult, the villain of the series, Roman. He actually, his son tells him when he's talking to the mainstream media, talk about the gays, and he's, all right, why are they tolerated and we are not? So basically, almost any complaint that you can have against polygamy, you can have against gay marriage or just gay relationships generally. So I think they are getting singled out very unfairly. Yes, when polygamy is outlawed, then polygamists will do bad stuff. That's a usual thing with black markets. Would they still be doing bad stuff if it were legal? Probably, on average, worse than the rest of the population. In particular, this fact that polygamists go and evict or exile or banish a lot of young males, and this is functional in the system, yeah, that probably is true. To go and say, well, polygamous societies are bad, so we don't want to be them, this is one where I think you really need to go and look at, like, how is it that you get to be really successful in these societies? So if the way that you get to have lots of wives is by being a great warlord, then sure, that's dysfunctional. What if the way that you get to have a lot of wives is by producing a lot of value? That's one where I'd say, even if there are some distributional downsides for low status males, on the other hand, just the fact that you have this as a motivation to be successful is really worth thinking about. Let's see, other things. So there is a standard list of all the bad things that polygamy causes. My general view is probably you should divide by about 3 in terms of how bad it really is causally. And then you should also go and think about good things, and especially be thinking about if you were to combine polygamy with a modern industrial society, it's not the same as having it be Genghis Khan going and attacking people and taking women as slaves. So it's really pretty different. Uh, Again, there is also this idea of the status of women is low in polygamous societies, whereas there's a basic supply and demand point of polygamy should raise the value of women because basically the highest value men are able to go and compete more aggressively. So again, what I would say is the best story there is reverse causation, where it's in societies where demand for women is low that you're more likely to get polygamy. So rather than polygamy makes women less valued, no, polygamy causally makes women more valued. But it's true that you're more likely to get it in societies where there is, for example, a big gender imbalance. How optimistic are you about the Yimbim when achieving dramatic gains in housing construction overall around the country? I'll put myself at like a 2 out of 10 on a 0 to 10 scale. So yeah, I'm honestly not that optimistic. Yeah, again, the main thing is if you're averaging over the whole country, if it's like, well, how optimistic are you that one major city in America will really improve? It's like, okay, then I'm at like an 8. But the idea that just because one city does things right, then other cities will go, oh my God, we're so wrong, let's copy them. That's really how politics hardly ever works. Normally, even if something demonstrably works well, people do not form their views based upon what's demonstrable. They do it based upon a philosophy, which they can practice with their eyes shut, actually. It's like, I just shut my eyes and know that it's bad to let people build stuff. I don't need to look at anything. All right, so that's where I am. Let's see. I think the rising credentialing has caused lower fertility. Yes, totally. I think that there's multiple mechanisms, but like I said in a piece I wrote a couple months ago, the simplest one is actually just there's a norm that you don't have kids until you get married. Or excuse me, excuse me, a norm that you don't have kids until you're done with school. That's the norm. Don't have kids until you're done with school. And once you have that norm, then the longer people are in school, then the fewer fertile years they've got. And while, yes, it's possible that you could go and finish school and then instantly start having a lot of kids, normally people don't want to do that either. You want to have a few years to get your career underway. And before you know it, you are out of fertile years. So I think that's very clear. There's other stories as well, which are complementary. One that's worth pointing out is when I was a kid, definitely we got propaganda about overpopulation and how bad that is. All right, so there's some of that. But I don't recall any propaganda about having kids is for idiots, only losers have kids. There's also propaganda against teen pregnancy, but I don't remember any propaganda about kids are for losers. However, I also don't remember any propaganda about it's good to have kids, not in school, not in Catholic Church. So who cares? Well, there's tons of propaganda about go and be a super successful student, get a bunch of degrees, and get a really fancy job. So if you have a lot of propaganda for something that is intentional with having kids and no propaganda for having kids, I think that is in practice antenatal, even if you never tell people you would be a fool to have kids. Especially if you just tell teenage girls, like, success equals being a female doctor. If that's the whole model that you push, then you are implicitly saying that kids are a low priority, and if you don't have kids but you're a doctor, totally cool. All right, and then seems like people are generally obsessed with credentialing their way up and accepted having kids as a normal milestone in life as opposed to an obstacle to get an MBA. Yes, true. Again, especially, of course, for women. Hard to have kids when you're in school for 20 years opposed to working. Agree. Wouldn't a decline in government subsidization or delayed entrance into the workplace help increase fertility rate? Yeah, I think that's totally true. All right, so let's see. I've got like 12 minutes left, and I'm taking my daughter to the doctor. All right, so let's keep going. So, seeing the issue of reproduction via economics is to miss what's driving our low birth rates. In a way, I agree. So what I'll say is, yes, there is a big change in attitudes. which has nothing to do with economics, really. Or in fact, if anything, the change in attitudes is running counter to the economics, because the economics comes down to we're super rich, we can now afford to have tons of kids, and yet we're having fewer. So if anything, I would say a simple economic model would actually say we're having a lot of kids. I'm very well familiar with the usual economist story of no, because the opportunity cost of having kids is more when women can get high-paid jobs. Like, I know that, but it's also true that when you're rich, you can have more kids. So at minimum, these things are intentional with each other. On the one hand, when you have high salaries, you can afford more kids. On the other hand, you're giving up more. But it is totally standard, actually, that for things that people enjoy, they get richer, and they actually, even when they're intentional with career success, they do them. So rich people take more vacation. The opportunity cost of vacation is higher when you have a high salary, but you're also more able to take vacation when you're rich. And guess what? Richer people do have more vacation. So I'll definitely say that there's a lot more going on, and the really big shift is changes in attitudes, big decline in traditionalism, for example. But that doesn't mean that economics doesn't still have a ton of useful stuff to say, right? Well, because economics is about improving things at the margin. It can well be that the reason that birth rates have collapsed from 4 to 1.5 is non-economic. Doesn't mean we can't use economics to go and get birth rates up from 1.5 to 1.8. I think that's actually quite reasonable. All right. First, I need to cover the difference between my savings and surrogacy costs because my wife can't have another, though we could raise them. All right. Well, that is, on the one hand, less than ideal, but on the other hand, it's one where if you have a big commitment to doing it, so like how much can you save? And then, depending upon your relationships with family, like how much would your parents, your wife's parents, be willing to contribute to this? This is one where the way you ask is very important, right? So, don't go up to your in-laws and just say, look, if you expect to get any more kids, you better shell out the money, right? Don't do it that way. But if you really want to get some results, again, just the idea of, like we're really looking to surrogacy, but it's really expensive, actually. Again, obviously, if the people that you're talking to don't have the money, then no need to burden them. But it's very normal for middle-class parents in the U.S. to actually be sitting on a gold mine, which is their house. And you can always cash out a house with different home equity instruments, right? So, and I think it's probably like $50,000. I don't think it's actually that much from the point of view of typical so middle-class retiree who owns their own home. I think actually most of them have $50,000 to spare pretty easily. And if you frame it in the right way, I take some time thinking about it. Obviously, there's some people who just don't care and are stingy or just aren't interested, but a lot of people actually are if you go and put it in a way they understand, especially like we really want another child, but like the only way we can do it is with surrogacy. We're really struggling here, and like we're just like, how would you feel about helping us? Like we'd be so grateful, right? I'd try something like that. Let's see, do the statistics. Most of it is readily explained by delaying marriage. Tax incentives not change this, might have a marginal effect. So again, this is one where we can speculate or we can look at the actual experiments. And the actual experiments do show that in particular, marital fertility is responsive to incentives. Right. So it is tempting just to say, let's just do it as an accounting exercise and say the main issue is following marriage, and then conditional upon being married, the number of kids that you have is not falling very much. That can all be true, does not mean that if you subsidize kids that married people wouldn't have more. So anyway, so it might have a marginal effect. I think it would definitely have a marginal effect, or like 95% chance would have a marginal effect. In terms of wouldn't change marriage, well, so if the payments are large enough, then it's a reason to have more kids. And if you want to have kids, guess what? Most middle-class people to this day feel like you've got to get married first. I mean, it is very interesting to me how often I ask people if they have kids, and normally the first thing out of a person's mouth is, no, I'm not married yet. Even today, this is not 1950, it's 2025, and still normal thing that people say is, I'm not married yet. So purely people link these together. And if there really was a great deal to have kids, then I think it's very reasonable to think that people would be getting married sooner as well. Of course, you could also go and have a tax holiday when you get married. Do it once, something like that. You could rescind the tax holiday if they divorce, if you're really going to be a hard ass about it. Let's see. What do you make of the meat eater argument against pronatalism? Average utility human life is net negative since most humans eat factory farm meat for their entire lives. Yeah, if you're a utilitarian, then plausibly you want humanity to go extinct. That's just harsh reality. I'm not a utilitarian, or a particularly kind of utilitarian where you count all sentient beings. Uh, there is this idea, well, like the animals wouldn't be having a good life without human beings either. But again, the idea that factory farming is worse than being in the wild, probably is like in the wild, they don't keep you lingering very often. Again, maybe the mice are in constant terror of getting eaten by birds or whatever, but probably they are like other animals. They don't actually feel constant anxiety when about general threats. You need to have something specific before they're actually feeling bad. Um, so, yeah, I mean, if you really are into animal welfare, then yeah, probably natalism is just the wrong focus for you. Uh, if again, so what if I put like some very tiny weight on animal welfare? Well, then it's different. Obviously, if you were really into this, you could say, I'm going to go and try to subsidize the vegan reproduction or something like that. But it's really slicing the salami thin in terms of how many people would be even possibly interested in that. My general view is I think everyone who's worried about animal welfare's important issue, moral issue is wrong, not because they aren't suffering horribly, but because suffering per se is not morally good or bad. It depends upon the intelligence of the being and the moral virtue of the being. And so that's why when how does that work? Well, quick version is a really evil smart person deserves hell. But on the other hand, a snake that goes and eats a bunch of babies shouldn't be put it out of its, just kill it painlessly because it didn't actually mean to do anything wrong. So the people the people where it is the greatest gain for them to suffer are smart evil people. So yes, so Hitler, peel his skin off one bit at a time, keep him alive, make him suffer, create hell on earth for him because there is not actually a hell, but that's what he deserves. On the other hand, intelligent, good beings, they should have very high levels of pleasure. That's good. And on the other hand, the dumber you are, the less it matters either way. All right. So, and does this mean that if there were a human being with the brain of a squirrel, that it'd be okay to eat him? It's like, yeah. If he really was that, if it really was like that, and then with the proviso of, well, is he going to permanently stay that way? So, or is he going to develop? Because of course, that is, you might say that that a fetus at some point has the brain of a squirrel, roughly. And I'll say, yeah, but the fetus is going to get smarter, so that matters too. All right, it's like, is that pro-life? It's like, well, it's in the pro-life vicinity anyway. Um, so I do have a scheduled piece that I'm going to write called Don't Get an Abortion on this topic. I think I actually have something new to say about it. I don't like just weighing in on an issue because other people have opinions if I don't have anything new to say. So I will try to say something new in that piece, but I'm just waiting to get myself prepared for how unfair people will be to me after writing it and how people get angry without reading it, responding to the arguments. Let's see. But simply, low birth rates are a natural byproduct of feminism. I'm super emotionally on board with that, but usual story is East Asian countries just have a lot less feminism in the West and that they got even lower birth rates than us. All right, so that at least should give you pause. You might say, well, gee, if they were super feminist in East Asia, then they would have no babies at all or something like that. It's like, all right, maybe. So maybe there's one cultural factor, which is just causing a general fall in fertility, and there's more of it in East Asia. And then there's feminism on top of that, which is less bad in East Asia, but they got some other problems that more than balance it out. I think there's something to that. But it's not as simple as it seems. It's definitely true that within Western countries, feminists are having fewer kids than non-feminists. So that does fit as far as we're going. So I think the right story is there's a bunch of things that matter, and feminism definitely isn't the whole story. Feminism definitely isn't the whole story. I think like a lot of it is just that there are a lot more fun things for singles to do in a world where people are so much richer. So that's just fact. Is in a pre-modern society, if you don't have kids, like what are you going to do? Right? You're just going to survive. It's like go to church. Like there's just not that many ways to go and spend your life in a fulfilling way. So in the modern world, you can be single and childless and be constantly engaged in something that feels pretty good. I think that it's ultimately disappointing, but I can see why it's less scary. It's like, well, would you rather be all alone in solitary confinement for the rest of your life, or do you rather be the last person on earth but you got the internet? It's like, well, they're both pretty bad, but yeah, like the internet sounds a lot better than being in solitary confinement, and I can walk around and do stuff. There's no people. That's really sad, especially for someone like me. All right, so I'll do one last do one last question, and then I'll sign off. All right. Should pro-natalist policy favor certain people having children over others? Could something like that even be politically possible? Um, so, uh, in terms of political salability, the answer that you want to say is no, but that's pretty crazy. And yes, there's strong evidence that, for example, criminality is heritable, and so while probably Charles Manson's children will not grow up to be murderers, but they definitely have a way higher probability of that. And so if you've got some finite amount of resources to encourage having kids, I wouldn't be encouraging Charles Manson to be having kids. Uh, so anyway, so like the general principle that you shouldn't be encouraging some people more than others seems wrong, especially if you think about this as a kind of philanthropy. So you should be trying to be an effective altruist, do as much good as possible. In terms of could it be politically possible? So my proposal, which is just to give people a tax holiday the year they have kids, it is a secret plan to go and encourage people that are likely to have kids that are more contributing members of society. I think it is saleable, and like officially, it's like, look, whoever you are, you get a full tax holiday every year you have a kid. Yet, of course, if you pay no taxes, then it doesn't actually give you anything. And on the other hand, if you're paying a lot of taxes, then it does a lot. I think this is very good in terms of effective altruism, and I don't think that this is actually unsaleable because it has the veneer of equality on the top. And obviously, someone could then go and show this video and say, aha, he admits it. And it's like, well, if you are stalking me enough to be able to find this, that's fine. I'm just here to go and say what I honestly think. I'm not going to do a noble lie. All right. So, anyway, thanks a lot. It was a lot of fun talking about this. This is one of my favorite topics. And if any of you are thinking of having kids and have any questions for me, I'm happy to go and take your emails. All right. A famous blogger who will remain nameless recently just sent me a bunch of questions about raising his kids, and I was all too happy to go and help him out. And maybe that'll lead him to have another kid if I can help him solve his current issues. All right. So bye-bye, everybody, and signing out.